Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. Thanks for being with us for show number, I think, 83, something like that. We're seen all over the state of Iowa as we produce a public access program here in Iowa City. We've got a great program tonight, so put the remote down and kick your feet back, because we're going to be talking to one of the people that are leading us into the future here in the state of Iowa. You know, it's often said about Iowa, we have no mountains, no ocean, and I like to say we haven't had any executive leadership in our state for a very long time, at least until recently. This last year and a half, we've seen some significant changes in the direction of our state, and coming out of this last legislative session, we've had somebody leading on a variety of issues, including reforming our entire long-term care system in our state, addressing issues of water quality, focusing attention on improving our health care system with the tobacco settlement money, finally addressing the issue of crumbling schools with some state support to school districts having trouble maintaining their school buildings. Those are just to name a few things, and you think I'd be talking about Superman, but I'm not. I'm talking about our governor, Governor Tom Vilsack, our guest this evening on Iowa News and Views. Governor, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
Governor, characterize, if you will, you've been in office 17 months and 17 days today. What have been some of the accomplishments, do you believe, of your administration to date, in kind of the general terms?
Well, I tell you, first of all, I need to know whether I need to refer to you as Senator or Joe.
Take your pick.
Okay, well, Senator then. I would say three things. First of all, when we campaigned in 1998, we laid out 5 promises we made to the people of Iowa. We talked about reducing class sizes, cleaning up water, fighting methamphetamine, lowering property taxes, and expanding access to health care, particularly for children. We've kept all 5 of those promises with the work that's been done in the first 17 months. Secondly, we have been fiscally responsible. 2 balanced budgets, budgets which comply with the 99% expenditure limitation law, and this year we had to veto appropriations from the Rebuild Infrastructure Fund, which the Republican-controlled legislature had approved, which were actually more than they had the authority to approve. So we had to reduce spending in that area. And last year we had to veto a significant number of tax cuts that would have really thrown the budget out of balance. So we've been fiscally responsible. And then I would say, third, we have begun the process of a quality of life agenda, moving forward on improving education, improving the environment, making communities a bit safer, a quality of life agenda that makes Iowa the best place to live, work, and raise a family. We still have a ways to go on that, though.
I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but the notion of executive leadership, the absence of which we've had for many years, I would articulate, there were a number of specific things that we did this year. The reform of the long-term care system, we're going to see about $100 million come into our state from the feds that we've lost out on for years, and we have a system that really doesn't meet people's needs.
Well, actually, if you look at the press clips from everybody in terms of the 4 major accomplishments of this legislative session, not a single one of them spends a single dollar of general fund tax money. All of them came out of our office in terms of initiatives, and the fact is they will draw into our state or generate additional investment of about $500 million to match state resources. So we have been fairly aggressive in those areas, but again, there's an awful lot of work to be done, Joe. A lot of work to be done.
Well, you've been very diplomatic, I think, about looking back. I've seen you speak plenty of times. I've not hear you speak in negative terms about past executive leadership in Terrace Hill, but I can. I just think that on those initiatives, the Republicans all came along. It's us 2 on clean water, us 2 on seniors, us 2 on school infrastructure finally. But the absence of some leadership on those issues, they've just been floating around for years.
Well, I'm convinced that if we had not proposed it, we would not have had school construction money out of the Millennium Fund. If we had not proposed it, we wouldn't have had a clean water initiative, notwithstanding the concerns expressed recently about the environment. There's a track record of not really paying much attention to the environment. If we hadn't talked about long-term care and grappling and dealing with that problem in an innovative, creative way, we would still be looking for answers and searching for answers. And frankly, if we had not been forceful in the tobacco fund, the settlement fund, making sure that it was used for health care, I was concerned that it would have been used for a variety of purposes not related to health care. So the fact is we were essentially leading the agenda, and the problem is that we spent a lot of time doing that instead of working together with the legislature to look at many of the other problems. We've got a terrible deferred maintenance problem with public buildings. We have needs with reference to state workers and training. We have a terrific need in technology. I mean, Joe, there isn't a $5 billion enterprise in this whole country that would spend the last dollar on technology. Most forward-thinking enterprises are spending their first dollar on technology. But we have to beg, borrow, and steal for technology money, and that's a concern to me.
So the lack of vision on behalf of the majority party, the Republican Party, what was it like this year negotiating on some of these issues? It seems like it's a group of people that are just kind of stuck in the mud. They don't really have any direction they want to take us.
Well, in the past, the Republican response has always been cut taxes. And the fact is, over the last 6 years, we have cut taxes to the tune of about $740 million annually. That's restricted our ability to respond to many of the challenges that we have in education, for example. As a result of that, Republicans proposed a series of budget targets that were really unrealistic and unreasonable, certainly in the education area. You cannot cut funding for higher education. You cannot underfund continually the community college system. You cannot ignore the basic needs of the K-12 system, as has been done for years, and expect the education system to continue to perform at the level that we in Iowa expect it to perform. So there has been a real concern there, and negotiations on the education budget were very, very difficult, and they didn't need to be as difficult. We could have reached common ground much sooner in the process.
So on the matter of Republican leadership and their vision for the future, we generally think of the Republicans not really interested much in government. They're interested enough to run, but they don't really see state government being managed in a way that would hum along like a finely tuned machine.
Well, to give you an example, going back to technology. Technology is the vehicle through which government can provide service to people on a 24-hour basis, 7 days a week. You have to invest in technology to be able to provide that service. If you don't believe that government has a role in providing services, then obviously you're not concerned about it providing them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week when it's convenient to people. Instead, we're going to compel people to stand in line, waste their time, trying to get permits and licenses that they would otherwise be able to get through the internet. That's the kind of frustrating experience we had recently with the Republican majority, because they just weren't willing to invest in technology. And as a result, people will wait in line, they'll be frustrated with government, and they'll have the wrong impression of government. There are many services that government can provide and do well with technology. And that's just one example.
So the Republicans, as we approach the elections this year, big election year, all 100 seats of the House are up, 25 of the Senate are saying, don't change the legislature, which is now controlled by Republicans, because we need to hold this governor in check regarding, the checkbook.
I find that really ironic. The first year of my administration, the Republicans passed tax cuts totaling over $100 million, knowing full well that if all of those tax cuts were approved, the budget would not balance. So we had to do the fiscally responsible thing to do and make choices which the legislature was unwilling, the Republican legislature was unwilling to do. This year, there was a big hullabaloo about the 99% expenditure limitation law. And based upon their interpretation of that law, the budget that they passed violated the 99% law. Not our budget, their budget. And then the infrastructure fund, which is a definite amount of money, as you know, $165 million. You can't spend more money than you have in that fund. But indeed, the Republicans did spend more money than they had in the fund, which compelled us to veto a portion of the infrastructure bill so that it would balance. So, Joe, I guess I would say, who needs to be in charge of what? Who needs to be keeping an eye on whom? It seems to me that it's the other way around.
So they overspent almost $500 million in the infrastructure fund, and that's the veto you talk about.
Right.
We're going to talk about tax cuts a little bit. You mentioned the number of 700 and some million a year, about 2.1 billion the last 5 years. I have a list of those here, and it reads like, certainly there was a 10% income tax cut, which, do you remember where your tax cut went? Do you know where it is now? I don't. I mean, I think it was a Happy Meal a week. But the other tax cuts is kind of a special interest laundry list of tax cuts to Republican supporters, I suspect in some cases, not in all cases. But when they talk about taxes, they talk about it from their perspective.
Well, the biggest thing we can do with the tax situation is to simplify our system and to make it more understandable and easier for people to deal with, and to lower the rates. Now, the fact is we could do that by eliminating federal deductibility. Now, that's a technical term, and your listeners probably may or may not understand what that is, because sometimes I don't understand what it is. But the bottom line is it's a system and a process by which you can take from your income the amount of income that you pay to the federal government for tax. Now, it seems like a reasonable idea on the surface. But what happens is that we then have to tax the remainder of your income at a disproportionately high rate, which puts Iowa in a competitive disadvantage for economic opportunity. Business knows it, labor knows it, tax preparers know it, those in economic development know it, chambers of commerce know it, everyone knows it, but it doesn't get changed. And the question is why? Well, I think there's a thread that runs through this process. We don't get tax simplification. We don't get trigger locks on handguns, child locks on handguns. We don't get campaign finance reform. And the reason we don't is because oftentimes the special interest is put ahead of the public interest. Tax simplification is in the public's best interest. Reducing rates is in Iowa's best interest. But it doesn't necessarily jive with the Iowans for Taxpayers Relief group, which is a heavy contributor to Republican campaigns. So that's maybe one of the reasons why we don't deal with campaign finance the way we ought to. Maybe it's why we don't have a simpler tax system. Maybe it's why we don't have safer schools and communities with handguns having safety devices on them so children don't misuse them.
Sure.
I think there's a pattern there.
Okay. Governor, give me your best case why we ought to have a Democratic legislature in 2001 on the issues you talked about, tax simplification and the others.
Let's start with the most important issue for all Iowans, which is education. We have to deal with teacher compensation. We have to put meaningful resources behind making sure that our teachers are adequately compensated. And the question is, who do you trust with that issue? Do you trust a party that has consistently underfunded and found ways to not support education, or do you trust the party, the Democratic Party, that has consistently vouched for, worked for, argued for more resources for education? On the environment, we continue to need to expand our water quality program, to also establish an air quality monitoring system, to invest in our natural resources. Who do you trust with that issue? A party that has been slow to understand the importance of investing in the natural resources, slow to come to the table in terms of water quality, or do you trust the Democratic Party, which is the party that in the 1980s developed the landmark legislation for groundwater protection? You know, clearly Democrats have a better track record on the environment. Who do you trust for safe communities? I mean, the reality is that we know that there are too many accidental deaths with handguns. We know that youngsters don't fully understand or appreciate how to use handguns. They get access to handguns. We know young people are taking them to school. We know that people are getting hurt. There's a simple way to avoid that by having a safety lock, a child safety lock on a handgun. Now, who do you trust with that issue? Do you trust the party whose chair says we need George W. Bush in the White House because we'll be able to, the NRA will be able to operate and work out of the Oval Office, or the Democratic Party that basically says, look, if we can do for aspirin bottles, putting safety child-proof caps on aspirin bottles, why can't we do it for handguns? It's just a series of issues. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that we have some very difficult issues to confront in terms of Iowa's future. And we cannot afford the time that's wasted in fighting useless battles. We had a huge fight this year, as you know, and you participated in it, on executive orders. Everybody in the Capitol knows that those executive orders are legal. They know it because they've asked a number of lawyers and law firms to render opinions about the legality of those executive orders. Everybody knows they're legal. Why did we waste all of that time? Why did we have 7 or 8 or 9 extra days to this session? Because we were fighting on issues that weren't about the people's business. So that would be the second issue. And then the third issue is that I think that we can unleash the creativity that the legislature has, that many of the leaders, including yourself, have, in terms of solving so many of these Iowa problems if we have the right kind of leadership the right kind of people in charge of committees. Let me give you an example. We lost a great guy in Paul Johnson in the DNR. Now, there are many reasons why Paul Johnson left. But to give you a sense of the frustration that this man had, now here's Paul Johnson, who essentially said to his wife of many, many years, I've got this job and this responsibility to do. You've got your career in northeast Iowa. You'll be able to continue with your career. I will travel to Des Moines. We'll be separated during the week, but I'll come home on the weekends. He's making that sacrifice. He's away from the land that he loves. He goes into a committee room to give testimony. It's at the end of the day, and he simply asked for the courtesy to be able to sit down and make his presentation. The committee chair said, no, in my committee, you will stand. It's that kind of partisanship that makes it difficult to attract good people to state government, people that have terrific ideas. I mean, Paul Johnson, in 16 months, did an extraordinary job. He crafted the Clean Water Initiative. He proposed fully funding REAP, which is something we haven't talked about, and frankly, if we had a Democratic majority, we clearly have a fully funded REAP program. So I would say, movement on key issues, trusting the Democrats who have a lifelong commitment to education, environment, and safety. B, making sure that we don't waste our time on issues that really aren't relevant to ordinary folks' lives. And 3, creating a process where we unleash the creativity of all of our folks in state government. And I think if we were able to do that, we would see a better Iowa.
Good, thorough answer, Governor. Thank you for that. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're actually past half point. We have a little commercial we'd like to do about the show. If we're ready to roll that, let's take that up. Iowa News and Views. We have a statewide network across the state, which you can check out on the screen there, and we also schedule regular times. So this show is on in 18 cities, regular time slot, every single week. Some of you Iowa News and Views viewers know that because in some locations the show actually plays multiple times. So you can catch us 2 or 3 times a week if you need that. We also have a web page. You can check that out. You can learn about who's been on the show and upcoming shows. You can also send us some email and tell us about what you think we ought to be doing with this show. And if you want a copy of this show with Governor Vilsack, there's some information about how you can get it. We'd appreciate hearing from you if you've got ideas about the show. If you want to come on the show, send me an email. We'll get you on. We're visiting with Iowa Governor Tom Vilsack. Governor, you've talked a lot about the food capital issue in Iowa, and most recently have been kind of out front on the genetically modified crop issue. And I want to say there's some concern out there by the scientific community as well as just ordinary folks about health concerns, safety of the seed stock, and also concentration issues in how we produce food. Is it a good idea to have maybe just a couple companies in the future? We may only have a couple companies now producing food, but as we look towards the GMO, you've been out front on it. Could you address some of that in terms of people's concerns?
Joe, it starts with a concern about general population in the world. The fact is that our world's population is growing at a dramatic rate. We will see 1 billion more people in the world in the next 12 years. Think about that. Think how long it took us as a population, as humankind, to get to our first billion. It took thousands of years. But in just 12 years, we'll have another billion. And 12 years after that, we'll have another billion. And that's with a B. And 12 years after that, we'll have another billion. So in your lifetime and my lifetime, the world's population will double. Okay, who's going to feed those folks? How are they going to be fed? We currently have 790 million malnourished individuals in the world. Close to half of them are children. How are we going to provide the nutrition that youngsters need to have to be able to grow, to develop, to be healthy, to be learners? We have a global economy. We're all going to rely on each other for goods and services. If young people are not well educated, we're all going to suffer, and the fact is you can't be well educated if you're hungry. So we've got major problems with population and malnourishment. Now, how do you solve that? Well, Historically, the way we've solved it was with science. What we now take for granted in terms of hybrid seed was not always the case. Back in the early 1900s, corn yields were determined on the appearance of the ear of corn. It had absolutely nothing to do with the genetics. It had absolutely nothing to do with crossbreeding or inbreeding. It just had to do with the appearance of the kernel, the appearance of the ear. If it was 10.5 inches long and 7.5 inches in circumference and it had 20 rows that were uniform, it was considered to be a good yielding corn. One person challenged that notion. His name was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace, as a high school student, challenged the notion that yields were related to appearance. He thought they were related to something else. He did tests, and he determined that if you crossbred inbred seed, that you would get a stronger seed, and you would, in fact, lead to greater yields. That touched off a revolution in agriculture. It took 20 years for people to accept the concept that Wallace developed, but now it's part of our everyday agricultural life. Biotechnology is controversial, but over time, people will understand that there are benefits that will accrue from the science. Now, it may take us setting up a different regulatory system, or it may take us the need for greater inspections, or it may take a labeling system over time. But over time, science is going to win out. And we have to accelerate the rate in which we do this science. We can't wait the 10 to 12 years under traditional processes for developing new products. If we do, another billion people are going to be in the world, and we will have not solved the problem. So we need quicker science. We have 50 products today on the market, biotech products that people are consuming. We have pharmaceutical products that were developed through the very same technique that we ingest, that we use to cure illness and disease. We don't question that, the use of those products, but it's exactly the same science. So it seems to me that we have more to learn, and it's important to stimulate the debate so that people discuss it, deal with the issues, and allow the science to proceed. And if it does, then I think we will be able to grow food more abundantly in areas that are currently challenged to grow food because of weather conditions. We'll also be able to grow food that is more enriched in terms of vitamins and basic essentials. We've got a rice product now that's got an enhanced vitamin A that might help prevent blindness in 100 million people. If we're able to do that, then we're going to be able to respond to this humanitarian challenge. In terms of concentration, clearly that's part of the market forces, but I would suggest to you that one way family farmers, small family farmers, will survive is by creating products that have greater value. One way to do that is by using science to create products that have an enhanced attribute. Now, that's not the only way. There's also going to be a move, I think, for organic products, and we ought to be promoting organic products. We ought to be encouraging people to get involved in that, and we ought to be able to establish and set up processes by which you as a consumer can be convinced that you're buying something that truly is organic.
Sure.
So I think that there are a series of things that we need to do, which is why we talk about food capital in the broadest possible sense. We put a food policy council together, which is designed to link what we are currently growing in Iowa to what we consume in Iowa, and to make sure that we maximize the opportunity to help Iowa producers out. We're also encouraging farmers to get into the processing business. Another way, frankly, of avoiding that concentration you talked about, by having farmers be the equity owners in processing facilities. And the beef packing facility that is being discussed with Excel, owned half by the Cattlemen's Association, is a model of doing that.
Sure. We're coming down to about the last 4 minutes. Your Strategic Planning Council, the 2010 Planning Council, is going to be coming out with a report probably in the next 60 days. And they've identified a host of issues, a host of challenges. Technology is one, but one is workforce, and the fact that we're going to have about 300,000 people retire in our workforce in the next decade, and we've only had approximately 100,000 people ever increase in population in a decade. We have this huge deficit in workforce. What do you anticipate from the Planning Council, and how will the work of the Planning Council be pushed ahead in your mind?
Well, the Planning Council will, as you know, because I believe you're involved in it, so you actually know more about the details than I do, but the Planning Council will issue its report in June. And it's just about the right time for us to be to incorporate it into what we refer to as our enterprise planning process at the governor's office, where we get department heads and administrative staff together to begin the process of formulating the proposals for the next legislative session, or proposals to move our agenda forward. So we will incorporate many of the suggestions and ideas and issues identified by the Strategic Planning Council in that planning process. You know, depending upon the nature of the recommendations, it may also then be necessary to go out and to begin the process of educating people about not only the problem, which is often easy to identify, but the solution. You mentioned workforce. Joe, there's only one way we're going to, not one way, but a way of dealing with this is by accepting and embracing diversity, which is not the easiest thing for a lot of us to do. But the reality is we're in a global economy. There are people have the ability to transport themselves anywhere in the world relatively quickly. There are people who are interested. I was in Des Moines the other night at a restaurant, and Howard University was sponsoring a program for their students to come to Des Moines to learn about the tremendous opportunities there are in Iowa. These were students from Africa. These were students from America. These were students from Jamaica, from all over the world. They were really impressed with Iowa. They assumed things about the state that they shouldn't have assumed. We assume things about folks coming from outside the state that we shouldn't assume. And we have to set up a process by which we can be a welcoming state and a compassionate and a tolerant and an understanding state. We did it in the 70s with the Southeast Asians. We can do it again. And by doing that, frankly, we also send a message to our own young people that we are going to create the kind of exciting, challenging, diverse world that they're looking for, that oftentimes they look elsewhere for. It won't be easy, but it's something that Iowa's got to confront.
Very good. Governor, we're getting down the last minute here. I appreciate you being here today and your leadership for the state of Iowa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
You've been watching Iowa News and Views. Thanks for tuning in. I'd like to thank the crew who's always doing the heavy lifting around here. Thank you once again. And hey, we'll see you next time.